Hi, I'm Erik Linask. We're here in the TMC studios in Norwalk, Connecticut, and on our program today, I've got Fletcher Hamilton. Fletcher is the president and CEO of Netsocket. Fletcher, good morning. Thanks for joining me.
Good morning, Erik. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. So wanted to talk a little bit about a couple of the hottest topics that really we're hearing about in the communications and the networking space. One of them really SDN, and it's been part of our conversation for a couple of years now, but it's kind of really grown and built significant traction very, very recently. To what do you attribute some of that growth and attention?
Well, I think it's all focused around maximizing the effectiveness of the solutions that are available today. And I mean that both from an application delivery as well as cost reduction. It's clear that application virtualization has already been proven, or the cloud functions within the data center. And legacy networks today are just not flexible enough really to keep up with the business drivers. And CIOs or enterprises and service providers have to do something differently. They have to provide a disruptive technology or solution to improve their bottom line.
Well, certainly, I think that term disruption is something we keep hearing over and over again, and people are looking for those disruptive technologies. But up until now, what are some of the things that have inhibited the adoption of SDN?
Well, I think it boils down and it goes along with other historical adoptions of new trends and technologies, and that's really standardization and interoperability. And they have to be tied together in order to develop real business applications and not just vendor science projects.
So I want to take a little closer look at some of what Netsocket is doing around SDN, and that's something called an SDN architected virtual network. Can you explain to me what that concept is?
All right, so SDN is a framework, and it's a three-tier framework that with applications that sit on the top that are driven by a centralized control layer that interfaces into an infrastructure layer. And that infrastructure layer, kind of think of that as the physical layer. So it's applications that are controlled and separate data and control plane, and an infrastructure layer at the bottom where the physical connectivity takes place, really where the rubber meets the road.
And how does the whole concept of standardization and interoperability that you just mentioned play into what you're doing?
So what we've done is we're kind of both an SDN framework as well as an NFV, or Network Function Virtualization company. We play in all three layers of the architecture of the SDN framework, both at the application layer as well as the control layer. And with our solution, which is more targeted towards the distributed enterprise, we split out the enterprises out at the infrastructure layer.
So you just referenced your focus on the distributed enterprise. Why have some SDN vendors really taken a focus more towards the data center, and then more specifically, why have you focused on the distributed enterprise, and how do SDN deployments in either scenario differ?
Well, let's take the data center is a unique animal that when you start to look at the cloud and the impact of the cloud and delivering services out at very large scale, that's where a lot of the vendors have focused on the data center. We at Netsocket have, based on our heritage, have always been involved in the enterprise, and we believe that's a very underserved market. There's a lot of complexity at the enterprise edge, if you will. Some of the differences that you find are associated with centralized data centers versus the distributed enterprise has multiple locations, and it has a few different problems that it has to solve. A lot of them are common, from a space, power, application agility. But when you're looking at an enterprise that may have 20, 40, 100 different edges, the management of that becomes significantly more complex and expensive to manage.
So to me, that seems like it's actually moving a little closer towards a service provider kind of scenario. So one of the other things I wanted to get into a little bit is, what does SDN mean to the service provider market? And then the other really term and concept that's become very popular in the service provider space in particular, of course, is NFV. And then what's a relationship in your mind between NFV and SDN?
Okay, so from a service provider standpoint, again, they're solving large scale data center issues typically, as well as delivering from a managed service provider out to these enterprise edges. When you look at it again, when I go back to SDN is a framework, network function virtualization or NFV is actually the functions that operate within that SDN framework. And I always like to take a very simple analogy and say, if you're looking at building a house, you have a frame and an infrastructure of a house, and the NFV functions are those things that you put in the house to make it more accommodating to you. And that, from a pure NFV standpoint, that could be, anything from firewalling to routing to WAN optimization.
Well, without question, that's the simplest analogy of those two concepts that I've heard. Well done there. How do you see SDN evolving over the course of the next couple of years in terms of its own evolution and adoption? And more importantly, what does that mean for Netsocket and some of the other vendors in your space?
Right, that's a great question. So evolution to me will be tied to the adoption of standards. And I keep going back to that because that's what allows a lot of this application versatility, the ability to get communities of interest. As long as there's organizations like the ONF, which are trying to standardize the three-layer architecture, vendors will start to really focus on what the business values they can provide. It's very important on all of these new solutions that you solve real business problems. And we look at it from the perspective of the enterprise solution. When you take what's traditionally distributed out there today in an enterprise branch, which can include a server, a router, a firewall, and a layer 2 switch, taking those types of solutions and reducing them from both a CapEx and OpEx cost as high as 4 to 5 to 1, that has significant value to the businesses.
Is there a difference in the value that an enterprise achieves versus what a service provider might gain from leveraging SDN?
I think at the end of the day, they're all about the same because it's all about taking cost out of the business. One of the things that we focus on very specifically at Netsocket is our ability to provide real quantifiable business value. And those are the things I think we've all learned over time, that the best technology doesn't always win. It's the best business solution that wins. And that's why we've gone after this specific market, which we believe is underserved, while a lot of the other larger vendors are going after the data center.
Great, thank you. I've been talking with Fletcher Hamilton. He's the president and CEO of Netsocket. Fletcher, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Erik Linask here in the TMC Newsroom.